Hello, everyone. Buongiorno. It's great to be here. Thank you all very much for coming. We're really grateful, all of us, to the Perugia Festival for inviting us. It's really great to be here. My name is Anne Koch, and I'm the Program Director at the Global Investigative Journalism Network. I'm going to be the moderator today for this event on investigating war crimes. And I'm joined by a great panel of three who you can see in front of you. I'll introduce you in a moment. Maybe for this audience, it's obvious why journalists need to investigate war crimes. But it is very, very difficult work and takes a lot of skills. And this is one of the things we're going to be talking about today, one of the many issues. There's also a debate, if you like, about whether journalists should work with law enforcement. Some journalists are doing that, including one of our speakers today, and other journalists feel that the tensions between the two responsibilities of lawyers and journalists are just insurmountable and they don't work together. So there's many, many issues. Before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to tell you that the Global Investigative Journalism Network is publishing a reporter's guide to investigating war crimes and crimes and conflict, investigating conflict. And it will be published in September, but I'm lucky enough that two of the authors are on the panel today. And as I say, I'll introduce them in a moment. And this guide will basically explain the legal background to crimes of war, which is very complex, but also share methodologies for investigating in the field, investigating war crimes. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers. First up, Anna Babinets, just on my right. Anna is based in Kiev, and Anna is investigating war crimes at the moment. Anna is the editor-in-chief and the founder of Slitsvo.info, which is an investigative outlet and a member center of the Organized Crime and Corruption Project. I'm not going to I'm not going to talk about all of the investigations that my colleagues here have done because we would be here all morning. So you'll hear about some of them in the, when they speak. Sarah El-Dib is a reporter with the Associated Press. Sorry, I have to stick to my mic. I need a mouthful. Drawing. Hey, you can tell I like public speaking. Sarah's been with Associated Press for many years. She's been a correspondent in most of the Middle East, and since 2021, she joined the AP Global Investigations team. This was just before the Russian invasion. She's also been part of the War Crimes Watch Ukraine, which is a collaborative project between AP and others and Frontline PBS in the US. And Sam Dubberly is the managing director of the Digital Investigations Lab at Human Rights Watch. And prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Sam was head of the Evidence Lab at Amnesty International for some years and led their open source research at Amnesty International. So this is our panel today. And what we're going to do is each person's going to speak for about 10 minutes because we're going to dig in a bit to some of the issues. And then we'll leave time for questions, but before the questions, we're inviting a colleague from the Global Fund for Media Development, Liz Bajutko, to come up and talk to us all about the Perugia Declaration, which was signed a year ago here in Perugia, obviously, to support Ukrainian journalists and media. And she'll talk for a couple minutes about that before we go to questions. So, without further ado, Anna.
Hello. Thank you for your introduction and thank you for having me here. For me, it's a big honor to be here. It's not my first time in Perugia. First time was 9 years ago when the war just started, when Russians invaded to Ukraine. And it was a lot of panels with Russians. It was a lot of discussions, and I'm happy to see here much more, a lot of Ukrainians and not a lot of Russians. I think now the world finally understands what's going on and who is right, who is wrong in this war. So thank you for having me here. Originally, I'm an investigative reporter, and I have investigative center, Slidstvo.info, which is based in Kiev, and we, before the war, we were a classic investigative center. We investigated corruption, we investigated corrupted officials, loud crimes, killings, like what we do as part of OCCRP network. We worked with Panama Papers and other big international investigations and projects. But when the war started, we switched, we transformed to investigation war crimes. I can say that that's what about I was dreaming. I mean, I never wanted to be a war reporter, war editor, because I never wanted to have the war in my country. But it's our work, that's what we can do. We know how to collect proofs because we were collecting proofs for years. Slidstvo exists for almost 11 years. So we decided that the war is a big crime, and what we can do, we can just collect the proofs of crimes. From the first day we started doing that. Our team, it's about 6 journalists, 6 investigators. From the first day we started to do this. We published, now we're publishing stories like almost every day. But I have 10 minutes, and I want to tell about one story, and I want to say that the most powerful stories we published, the most powerful stories we had, it's stories which came from people, from Ukrainians. Stories, not only stories, they sent us proofs. They believe, they trust that we, as journalists, we as investigators can show the truth. And it's very important for us that they believe in us as journalists. So the most powerful stories came from Ukrainians, and they usually sent us like lists of Russian soldiers where they found after the occupation of territories. They sent us proofs. I will tell you about the story of Lisa. This is a very, very young girl. She's 18 years old. She's from south of Ukraine, and her hometown, I will not mention the name for security reasons, was occupied. And what 18 years old girl might do? She used dating application before the war for dating, for meeting new boy, for meeting with them. And she decided to she had to move with her parents from hometown, and she wanted to help somehow, and she decided to use dating application for chatting with Russian soldiers. And she asked them details, where they are, what they are doing, and what unit they represent. It was like nice chatting between young people. We filmed her, we interviewed her. Of course, we anonymized her because it was dangerous for her to appear. And what she told us that she, being young woman, being young girl, she thinks that all of Russian soldiers, militaries who came to her hometown, they are criminals, and only one thing she wanted, to punish them. And because she had some plans for the summer, she wanted to spend the time with friends, to take some her money for working, for taking rest. But because of Russians, all her plans were destroying. And during this texting, she found a few Russian militaries. This is one of them, Denis Tikhonov, and he uses the same application Lisa used. And he sent her pictures, he sent her voice, voice messages, they were chatting. And Lisa gave all these pictures, all these voice messages to Slidstvo.info, to our journalist. One day she just texted us that she obtained a lot of information, pictures, voice messages, and she knows that it has some value, but she didn't know what to do with that. But she saw our stories, how we identify Russian soldiers, how we identify during the war some important things. And she gave them to us, and we start to work with pictures. For example, that pictures, it's like regular OSINT, everyone uses it. And before the war, thanks to our colleagues from Bellingcat, they gave for us 3 days training about this stuff, because I think every investigative journalist used it. But for us, it was very, very important and useful because Bellingcat works a lot with Russian social networks like Odnoklassniki, VKontakte, and others. And they showed us more tools, and right 1 week or 2 weeks before the war, we already had all these tools, and we used them and still use them for our stories. So we found that boys sent their pictures to Lisa, and we understood that it's somewhere from the south of Ukraine and start looking at maps, and we found like proper location where exactly that unit were. There are some, you see, like sexy picture of the man he sent her. Yeah, it's Ukrainian territories, it's Ukrainian buildings, and they captured them. And we just tried to figure out where is it, because sometimes they told her proper village or some city, sometimes they just sent her that we somewhere in Kherson region. Kherson region was occupied for 8 months, and now it's still partly occupied. And we had this region, it's like very big piece of land, and we were looking on Google Maps and tried to find where exactly is it. So yeah, and then it's only one boy she communicated with, and then we just found the place where that person took pictures, and we found that it was village Sonichnen in the Kherson region, and we published the story. So we found the soldiers, and we found who exactly that people, their names, surnames, and in what unit they were, what exactly that unit did in territory of Ukraine. We published this story like a few months ago. And actually Lisa was very happy because she collected this data and she wanted to be useful somehow. She wanted to help the war will finish and what she can do as a young woman. She just sent us that stuff and we published as journalists this story. Yeah, so, and I know that she's still doing that, and I hope she communicates not only with journalists in this case. We don't know this, we're doing only our journalist work. So we have many stories like this, but this is for me one of the most impressive stories because I don't believe that it can exist without the war, stuff like this, when young women using dating application for actually killing people, for trying to find the way to kill them because she wants to come back, and Russians still in her hometown and it's not possible for her. And we published like more than 150 videos for this time, and they have more on our YouTube channel, and they have more than 50 million views. It's much, much, much more than we, like 10 times or more times more than we had before the war. And for us, we never had so strong communication with our audience, with people, and they text us, they try to send us all the stuff. And I just want to say that now we are not classic investigators in Ukraine, we investigators of the war, and everyone in Ukraine now investigator of the war, because we understand that in what world we live, and we need to collect proofs, and we believe, Ukrainians believe, and we try to give them something which we can give as journalists, that the war will finish thanks to them, and criminals will be punished. I think it's very important for our people. That's why they collect this information. And a lot of proofs we published were used and still using by Ukrainian officials, by Ukrainian prosecutors, and actually the training we got from Bellingcat. Then in first months of the war, Ukrainian prosecutors and other special services asked our journalists to train them how to use OSINT, because they didn't have this experience before the war, and now they use it, and I hope it helps as well. So this is my short presentation. It's only one story. You can see more stories on our YouTube channel, on our website. We translate all of them in English. Again, I dream about the day when we come back and being like normal investigative journalists, telling about corruption, about officials, about what we did before the war. But now we have this task, and I'm very happy, if it's possible to be happy in this situation, that a lot of Ukrainians help us, and all together we investigate the war, and we have this wonderful and awful stories in the same time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Extremely impressive work. I just have one question I wanted to ask you before I pass to Sarah, which is, do you work with other journalist organizations as well? I mean, it's really interesting. You talk about collaboration with citizens, of course. It's at the base of what you do. And I mean, obviously, there's a huge audience now. Do you also work with other journalists investigating?
Yeah, we cooperate. We publish some project with local media from Kharkiv. Kharkiv, it's region close to Russia as well. And we published big story about one occupied city, how it's going on. So we communicated with local media, because I should say that for local medias, it's harder times now than for national medias, especially from the east of Ukraine. They had to move, they don't have access to the place, and it's very hard. So we communicate with local media, we cooperate, we published a story, and also OCCRP, it's our big partner, and we're doing international stories with them. Thanks to them, we have access to big international audience. So yeah, we cooperate and we publish stories for them as well. Yeah, so I can say that we're doing a lot of cooperation, but we're doing with local and with international, yes.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you for having me. And for me, it's actually my first time in Perugia, so this is quite an intense experience. Very, very proud, esteemed panel, and also to be in the company of such great journalists from everywhere. My experience is also a little different from Anna. I mean, I've been working in the Middle East for 20 years. There's lots of such war crimes and violence, and we did this for lots of time. I was working on Syria before the war in Ukraine broke out, and then when that started, I thought I have something to share because I've covered Russia's war in Syria, where it got involved since 2015 and kind of turned the tide of the war. But Ukraine was really quite different. It was different because where it happened, because of the international attention, but also because of the immense institutional support and resources that we had immediately at the start of the war. From the beginning, AP and Frontline decided to collaborate, and about 25 reporters from Ukraine, Europe, Middle East, and the US were on the project. There were editors, fact-checkers, data analysts, and it was a big team. There were people on the front line, there were people like me behind desk kind of going through all the material that was available online to kind of verify and to try to see what we can do with it. I think the project was developed as we went along. We just found how much material there was, and we started something called the War Crime Tracker, which was also in collaboration with other local and international organizations that were doing similar work, kind of going and vetting. The amount of information that was available was just immense, so it needed all hands on deck, and everyone was kind of working to verify, geolocate, and make sure that what we're seeing is consistent with other people, what other people are seeing. There were, by the end of the year, this was a year-long project, by the end of the year there were about 650 plus documented and verified incidents that were in that war tracker, which is available for the public, but also sometimes was, it was really the way we decided to write reports, because we see trends, we identify what's happening on the ground, and then from there we produce reports. I mean, this AP is a pretty big organization, so we had a lot of people working on that. And the first report was about hospitals being attacked, targeted deliberately. We recorded 34. That was within the month of the war beginning, obviously. It seemed to be a trend, and it wasn't something that happened by coincidence or surprise. My job was, I didn't go to Ukraine. I stayed where I usually work, which is in Beirut, and helped kind of populate that tracker that we were creating. The workload was divided between a bunch of us around the clock in different continents. We were working to verify and go through the incidents. And from the tracker, we came up with, like I was saying, enough material to kind of put out reports. Some reports didn't pan out, so we would be, like, for instance, I stayed for a while tracking attacks on religious worship places, but didn't feel like I could just write another story that there were 25 religious places were attacked, and felt like I needed a bit more, something. So this didn't pan out. But but what took my time was actually the story of children being deported to Ukraine. It was something that I heard from sources while talking to people in Ukraine, activists, and it was a really difficult story to put together. It was something, I was in Ukraine and I could see it from my desk in Beirut. I spoke to activists, I spoke to my colleagues who were on the ground, but it was so hard to get to talk to families, because this was happening in real life. They were trying to bring back their kids, so they really didn't want us to write about it. So it was, but it was happening in many places. So it was a really difficult story to piece together. It took about 6 months, I think. And when we got really lucky when one of our colleagues in Moscow was able to actually find a family in Moscow that had Ukrainian kids. So that was kind of completed the thread of the investigation, and we were able to say, look, we found parents looking for their kids, but also we found kids in Moscow. But this was, I can talk more about that in the questions, but I wanted to spend some time also to talk about how different this was when we were working on Syria. For instance, Syria has been at war for 10 years, more than 10 years. It's been 13 years now. Nothing about this is easy. But it's also, we learned as we learned this as it was going on. There were so many violations. There were so many attacks. There were, but it was also always breaking news. There was no time to like step back and decide what are we going to do, what the big project was. But we also, it was a great thing in Ukraine to have a big team that was kind of ready and led and devoted all their time to do investigation on that and write big reports and kind of take it further beyond the spot story or the news, the breaking news. And of course, it's a big organization, so we had that. But in Syria's case, there were many difficult problems to deal with on the spot. There were chemical attacks. There were barrel bombings of cities and towns. There were sieges. There were starvations. Journalists were attacked. Foreigners were kidnapped. But then also access was a huge problem. For the longest time, journalists were either denied entry into Syria by the Syrian government, or they were not able to enter rebel-held areas because it was too dangerous. Their lives were at risk. And that made us completely reliant on remote coverage, right? We had to find people through WhatsApp, through Facebook all the time. Infrastructure that was also being targeted all the time. So I just thought none of this is really new to you, but it's kind of glaring when you see the numbers of how long this is going on for very long. So citizen journalists and witnesses on the ground were our main source of information. And that took a long time to verify. And this is, I'm just talking about like a report, like a spot news to confirm something has happened on the ground. But then that also left us open to question, and campaigns from pro-Russia and pro-Syria advocates who said this is not, you weren't there, you don't know what happened, the witnesses are fabricating stuff, you don't have enough evidence. Up until today, for instance, Syria denies that there were ever any chemical attacks, while activists and rights groups have recorded more than 30, most of them carried out by the Syrian government. When we finally were able to return to Syria, it was divided between different powerful players, Turkey, Russia, Iran, the US. So when you go to one area, you couldn't go to the other area. So you always had a skewed view, or at least one-sided view of what's happening on the ground. But the real big problem has always been that the international community couldn't really agree on what to do with Syria and how to push for criminal justice. And I think this is something that's uniquely available for Ukraine. And now it leaves us all, people who covered Syria, with a heavy heart, because we've worked for so many years, but we have failed to push the agenda or make sure that Syria gets the same kind of criminal, the same kind of attention that Ukraine's getting, even though players are almost the same. Bringing the perpetrators in Syria to justice remains a long way off, and Russia has blocked all attempts to start an ICC investigation. So that means we, as investigative journalists, with the resources and editorial support, we still have a lot to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah just made the most compelling case for the reason why we need this work by investigative journalists in her example of Syria. And I think we know that. I just want to tell everyone that Sarah has written a really brilliant chapter for this guide I mentioned earlier for reporters on investigating war crimes, which is on investigating missing people, and comes directly out of her experience working with the team at AP. And it's brilliant. And now Sam, who's also contributed to the Reporter's Guide, and Sam has written a chapter on open source investigation and its limitations. And he's going to tell us about his investigations now. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Anne. And also congratulations, Anna and Sarah, for all the work you've been doing to cover these crimes, these potential crimes, and really appreciate everything you've brought to that. I'll start with, it's loud, sorry. I'll start with something maybe slightly positive. You were saying, Sarah, criminal justice is a long way off in Syria. It is, of course it is, but I think we should never forget that it could come from anywhere. That point could come from anywhere. And I just wanted to point to the trial last year in Koblenz in Germany, for example. There are all sorts of mechanisms which makes the work that we're all doing, that you're doing, that people in this room are doing to cover violations of international humanitarian law, potential possible war crimes, really important because it can come from anywhere at any time when we least expect it. And this trial in Koblenz started, which led to the prosecution of a Syrian colonel in the Syrian army for war crimes, started with two Human Rights Watch reports. And what we're doing is effectively helping prosecutors or leading prosecutors to build their cases from our work. And I think that's really important to remember because that arc of justice is so slow and feels so intangible and so unattainable so often that there are actually moments which make our work really important. And I think we all have to remember that when we're doing this work. And at Human Rights Watch, that's something we have to tell ourselves time and time again, right? Because the work we're doing all the time is looking at these cases, these worst possible cases that exist around the world in all sorts of different armed conflicts, all sorts of different situations where international humanitarian law, the laws of war, apply. So, we're looking, yes, at Ukraine, and we were in Ukraine since the 23rd of February, present in Ukraine since the 23rd of February. Syria is a different kettle of fish. The access was so hard, so dangerous, but we've been covering Syria, all along, and still are looking at what's going on in Syria. But also, at Human Rights Watch, we're looking at all those kind of different theaters where international humanitarian law applies. So we're still looking at Myanmar, we're still looking at what's going on in Ethiopia, in Yemen, and then, more recently in the last week, what's going on in Sudan. And it's so important that all this documentation happens. My team at Human Rights Watch is called the Digital Investigations Lab. And we are a very small team of geospatial experts, open source investigators, data analysts, 3D modelers. That makes it sound like a really big team, doesn't it? It's a team of 6 who work on all these different areas as well as other violations of human rights that Human Rights Watch covers. When we're looking into this, we're using open source information, and I'm going to just focus on the open source information part to kind of the chapter we wrote for GIJN. When we're looking into this, open source information, open source investigations, digital investigations, whatever we want to call it, play a really key role in this work because it helps us with the access, of course. Those places we just cannot actually get to. It helps us cover a wider range of stories. The amount of data that's coming out of Ukraine, the amount of data that came out of Syria, the amount of data that's come out of Khartoum in the last week is so key for us to capture, but also to, of course, verify, to make sure that it's actually what it says it is, that it actually happened where we said it happened, and so on and so forth. For Human Rights Watch, so crucially for us, the use of open source is almost like a gateway into answering an initial question of should the incident we're looking at be investigated further as a potential violation of international humanitarian law. As a human rights organization, obviously we're different from the newsrooms. If we don't think a violation happened, we will obviously stop reporting. As sad as it is, just because civilians have been killed in a conflict does not necessarily mean a violation has happened, does not necessarily mean a possible war crime has happened, right? So we actually use open source information as a way into thinking about whether we should investigate further. Assuming that threshold passes, then we're using open source information along with our teams who are actually conducting interviews, speaking to witnesses to these possible crimes, to these possible violations, to look at, for example, what kind of military activity do we see, either in videos that have been captured on the ground or in satellite imagery. What possible legitimate military targets were there? Because that's really important. That's a really important decision to look at some of the thresholds of potential violations. So we're asking ourselves all the time, are there actually possible legitimate targets here that we should be considering? We can also use it to look at civilian activity. I'll point, for example, there to the research we did, or the investigation we did into the cluster munitions attack on Kramatorsk train station, which happened in April of 2022, in which a very high number, over 60 civilians were killed. One of the important things there was looking at civilian activity around that station in the days before. So we were able to use open source information to look at the amount of people who were actually transiting the station, civilians transiting the station, to actually flee the front line. Which then, when it comes to thinking about the targeting decision that's made, so the person who actually decided, the officer who actually decided, we need to fire a missile on that station, we actually know there's actually information that they should have had in mind when they were making that targeting decision. We're also using open source information regularly, as many people here do, for weapons identification. That can be looking at a fragment of a missile, the type of weapons that are used, the type of rifles that are used, et cetera, et cetera. And then looking also at the prior state of a target before an attack. So thinking of the word children written in front of the theater in Mariupol, that you could see that from space should also be factored into the actual targeting decision and the determination of whether a potential violation of international humanitarian law happened or even a possible war crime happened. And then finally, another area that we look into using open source information, which is very tricky and requires a lot of expertise and actually outside consultation, is potential injuries. So if we're looking at torture, for example, do we have photographs and videos which show injuries and wounds? Can we show those to a forensic pathologist, for example, who can actually then give us a determination? That's a very tricky area that requires a lot of expertise, and a lot of this does require us to go to experts who are out there, to talk to them, to get a determination. And of course, that should only really be used to back up interview testimony that we've talked about. I think the important thing here, and I'm just conscious of time, but the important here is that the open source really is just a piece of the jigsaw in Human Rights Watch's investigations into war crimes, potential war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law. It's very limited. I often think of a great academic who's worked a lot on international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflicts is a woman called Françoise Hampson. And Françoise and I sit down quite regularly and talk about this, and she's always berating me for not thinking about the information that the targeting officer has at hand when they're making a targeting decision. That's something that open source information, for example, cannot help us with, very rarely. There are some instances where that can happen, when we have perpetrator video, for example. Often we've seen it a lot in Ukraine, we saw it a lot in Syria, of course, where perpetrators themselves actually have filmed themselves committing crimes. When I was at Amnesty, I worked on a piece with CNN looking at a massacre in Ethiopia, where we could actually see the officers, massacring a group of captured male men on a cliff top. There we could actually see what was going on, the criminal intent that was in the minds of the perpetrators. But very rarely do we actually have that in other contexts, especially in a context such as Syria or Ukraine. Couple of other final thoughts. Collaboration really is key here. Both, I would invite journalists in the room to speak to Human Rights Watch about what we found very regularly. We're very open to collaboration in this space. I think we can help each other expose more potential war crimes, possible violations of international humanitarian law. I should also say, consulting with legal experts is also really key to make those final determinations. Consulting with weapons experts, consulting with country-specific experts really is key. I'd also say that journalists have helped us. If I go look back to Kramatorsk, the investigation we did in Kramatorsk, one of the key pieces of evidence was B-roll filmed by a journalist who was there, who didn't publish this information but gave it to us, which allowed us to make a huge host of determinations about the lack of military activity at the station at the time. Then finally, ethics. I think, ethics is a tough one, but when we're investigating human rights violations, we don't want to be violating human rights ourselves. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind when we're doing this kind of work. And I'll actually just leave it there. I think that gives some food for thought into our process at Human Rights Watch of how we're approaching investigating war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law at the moment.
Thank you, Sam, so much. Just a quick question. How much do you collaborate with prosecution?
Obviously, we talk to prosecution. I often get this question, like, do you give your evidence to the ICC? No, we don't. I think it's really important that what we do, we put out there. We hope, therefore, that it's, what we publish is very robust. Our reports can be quite long, but within that, there should be a whole host of analysis, interviews, how we've done our open source information, methodologies, and we hope then that, that leads us a way for prosecutions to build on what we've presented. I think it's really key that we're kind of operating in our separate lanes, right? It's like, we're in an independent organization. We found out what we find. We put it out there for the world to look at, and then if prosecutors want to build on that, that's awesome.
Great, thank you very much. So to the audience, if you can start thinking about your questions, but first I'd like to invite Lisa. Where are you, Lisa? To come and talk to us for 2 minutes, please. Thank you. Yeah, do you want to sit here?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Anne, and speakers and organizers of the festival for giving us an opportunity to spread the word. So I'm Lisa Bezushko. I'm from the Global Forum for Media Development, and I've been leading GFMD's work in information sharing and coordination of media development and journalism support organizations working with Ukraine. And as some of you may remember, a year ago, more than 200 media support organizations came together to draft and promote Perugia Declaration for Ukraine at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia. It was translated into 10 languages, and it has been a basis for our policy and advocacy efforts throughout the year. And it contains calls to action to several key actors, in particular to international media and journalism, to private and public donors and funders of professional journalism, to the EU member states and members of the Media Freedom Coalition, as well as technology, telecoms, internet intermediaries, and advertisers. So it contains a lot of call to actions. Some of them are particularly relevant to the session today. So for instance, it encourages technology, telecoms, internet intermediaries and advertisers to prevent automatic takedowns of journalistic content documenting evidence of international crimes of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious human rights violations. It also, which is another quite relevant point in terms of Ukraine media landscape, it urges international media and journalists to affirm that field producers are journalists and not fixers, and they deserve the same right and respect, support, and social security and all the credit as all journalists actually cover in the conflict. So 1 year after the launch of the Perugia Declaration for Ukraine, GFMD is reaching out in collaboration with the organizers of the festival to assess the declaration's impact and identify ways to strengthen its further implementation. And we would like to invite all of you to contribute to this process by sharing your suggestions and your feedback on how to improve and update the declaration. So you will find the full text of the declaration on our website at gfmd.info/Perugia Declaration for Ukraine. Feel free to reach out to us. You will find our contact details on our website. Feel free to reach out to us on our social media. And for the sake of the immediate future and safety of our Ukrainian colleagues, as well as the long-term viability of independent public interest journalism everywhere, I think this is the moment that we all need to rise to. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Here, there's one in the front here. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Jen Stout. I'm a freelance journalist and I'm often in Ukraine for the past year. I have two just very practical, straightforward questions for Sam and Anna about how you're gathering this material. It's really interesting, the motivations of people who send you this material. So, for instance, Sam, why did this journalist keep that material? Why did he decide to send it to you? And do you actively reach out to these people and encourage them to use you like this? Why not a journalist outlet? And yeah, Anna, I mean, the material that you had from that young woman was just incredible. How do you manage that situation? And is there a tension between you and, say, the army, who maybe, I know a lot of people in Ukraine in occupied areas are sending information to the army at great risk to themselves, to intelligence services of Ukraine? Is there a tension between you and, say, the SBU? Would they rather that that information only goes to them and not to you? Thanks.
Okay, Sam, do you want to take it first?
I can take it first. I mean, I think when we're doing the open source investigation, one of the key steps, as everybody in this room probably knows by now, is like actually finding out the source of that information. Like, how close can you get to the source? So in this situation, we were, it was grainy videos that were doing the rounds, and then we're like, wait a minute, that, it's too well filmed. Those kind of questions we start asking ourselves, and then we're like, well, can we actually track down whose content this is? Then find the source, actually get down to the source, and then we did, and then obviously we were like, well, if we're going to use this guy's content, we need to pay him. Then it's suddenly not open source information in the same way, right? It's like we found it through open source investigations, and then it was just genuine kind of questioning of like, well, do you have any more? And then suddenly it opened up this whole space of like, yeah, of course I do. It's like, it's just sitting there. Why don't you take a look? And if you want to use it, feel free. And we, arranged a fee with him, and there we go. So we're always trying to do that. We're always trying to get through to the original source of the content as close as you can as part of the verification process. But then increasingly that opens up into new spaces. So it's being prepared to go that step further and take the time to actually do that, which is something we can do at Human Rights Watch. It's like we actually can sit with a story for a long time, which I think Anna and I were talking about yesterday. It's like you don't have the capacity because there's so much going on, whereas one of the contributions maybe we can make as a large-ish organization, not AP size, largest organization is stick with something for a while and go deeper. And that doing that allows us then, I think, to pull out some kind of better investigations.
Thank you for your questions. First of all, I should say that now Ukrainian women have to manage everything, because every Ukrainian man can be mobilized, can be recruited to army. To my best reporters, male reporters were recruited to army, so now they serve. And mostly my reporters are female. So we work now, and I think that all Ukrainian medias, almost all of them now managing mostly by women, because it's only one way to do journalism in Ukraine, because we know that Ukrainian men are in very hard, difficult situation. I mean, everywhere, and they are good as journalists, but they have to be citizens, and they might be recruited every moment. And question about cooperation with officials, with security service and others, we don't cooperate with them because we are journalists, and even in that hard times we try to keep all standards. If they ask us to share some information, some stuff we publish or our findings, we do it. If they ask, we just send them links, you can take some stuff. If they want to question or interrogate our journalists, I just ask them if they are okay and they can have this questioning as witnesses. Also, when they ask us about some contacts of people we interviewed, we never share contacts with them before permission. So I understand that we are all citizens, we want to win, but we are journalists in this war, and we try to keep all the stuff. They can take information from our stories, we are happy. It was even hard for us to decide if we agree that our journalists to train prosecutors and others. But we decided in the end that if we're sharing our knowledge, it's not like sharing information. It was first time when we did it, and I hope it helps them, because we knew that they couldn't take this information, couldn't take that knowledge anywhere, only from us. So in general, we don't cooperate, but we're always happy if they take some information and puts them to official criminal investigations, and we're always happy, but we try to keep all journalist standards we have in this difficult situation.
Thank you. I would like to take another question, but I've just been told we're running out of time. We've run out of time. If anyone would like to come and talk to us afterwards, we'll be around. So sorry about that. Sorry there wasn't much room for questions. If you're interested in war crime investigation and reporting, by the way, I just want to give a shout out to colleagues who are running a session today, this afternoon at 2 o'clock. You'll see it on the program, So I just want to say thank you all very much for coming. And also thank you very, very much to my esteemed panel. Thanks again.